Okay, everyone, this is the answer to the first question, which you can see there is explain the factors that need to be considered before deciding whether it would be an advantage to teach a skill by whole practice. Now, my first piece of advice to you would be to identify what whole practice is. Whole practice, you will remember, is when we practice the skill in its entirety without breaking it down into small parts. It's got nothing to do with the number of people that are involved, which was one misconception in this particular question. It's just practicing the whole skill for a long period of time without breaking it down. All right, with that in mind, let's move forward and look at some of the answers that we could have used. And also, I need to make sure, just before we do that, that you're completely aware that when we talk about the 6 marker, the 12 marker, given that this is going to be 2 parts, one is going to be psychology, one is going to be physiology, making up the 12 marks in total, you've got to make sure that you make lots of different points. I can't emphasize that enough. Okay, so rather than just making 1 or 2 points and talking about that for a little bit, you need to make lots of different points and talk about those relatively briefly. Okay, so let's move on then. So first thing we need to say is, okay, why might we consider using whole practice? Well, it depends upon the nature, the type of the skill, and that would mean it depends if it's a complex skill or if it's a simple skill. And if we come down here, we'll see a little bit more explanation to that. So we're going to use a whole practice if the skill is complex. Now, a complex skill means that it's hard to break down. It's hard to break down into smaller subroutines, and sometimes it's referred to as having high organization. We would also use a whole practice method if it was a discrete skill, which you'll remember has a clear beginning and a clear end. Now, at the other end of the continuum, we would also use whole practice if we were looking at a simple skill, because a simple skill is relatively easy to do. It doesn't require breaking it down into subroutines, and therefore it's easy to complete as a whole movement. All right, but we do need to explain those if we're going to get some credit here. Now, moving on here, depending on stage of learning, beginner, novice, experience, most of you scored some sort of credit here. However, 1 or 2 of you fell into the trap about talking about age and not experience. Please don't fall into the trap of age. You've made the assumption just because people are younger, they might not be experienced, and that might not necessarily be true. You could have an 11-year-old who's a fantastic gymnast who's been doing gymnastics since they were 4. Just because they're 11 doesn't mean that they're not very good or they're not experienced. So let's get the terminology right, please, and use the stage of learning. Use beginner, use novice, use experienced. All right. And basically what we're saying here is that, again, underneath, we're going to use the whole if they're autonomous, because they know exactly what they're doing and they're replicating on the movement and getting it into their long-term memory. We will also use it for the cognitive stage because it's getting the feeling for the whole movement. All right, now moving on, depends upon the safety and time. So 1 or 2 of you did mention this was absolutely fine. If we are short of time, whole practice is excellent to use. Also, if there's no risk or danger of injury and it's safe to do so, we would use whole practice. However, a number of you also talked about the size of the group, and whilst we've looked at size of group in terms of things to consider, you didn't get any credit for that in this particular situation. If you mentioned the size of the group might make it dangerous, then you would get the point because you're focusing in on safety. Moving on from here, a lot of you did well here with the next point, which is depends upon fitness. As you can see, whole practice if the performer is fit enough, but not just because of time and being able to keep going over time, but because they're able to manage repeating skill. And that's the key point here, that they're fit enough to continue to manage the skill over time. And then the last point, which again a lot of you got some credit for, was this one. It depends upon the level of motivation, that we're going to use whole practice if the performer is highly motivated and therefore they're going to be engaged in doing the practice. And similarly, if you mentioned other points of the opposites, that would have been fine. Okay, so a few things to think about there, but please make sure that you review this and you're clear as to when we would use whole practice.